The woman standing before him didn't flinch. She had a quiet stillness about her, the kind that came from someone who had stared death in the eyes too many times to be rattled by mere condescension. The sunlight cut across her uniform, glinting off the faint scar that traced from her jawline to the hollow of her neck. Her hands were steady at her sides. Her eyes, a deep steel gray, met his with polite indifference. "I asked you a question," the admiral continued, his voice heavier now, as a few officers in the briefing room exchanged uneasy glances. She finally answered softly, as if saying it to herself. "Iron Widow." For a moment, the room fell silent. Then the admiral gave a short, dismissive laugh. "Iron Widow? That's dramatic." His chuckle echoed, drawing a few reluctant smiles from those who didn't dare stay stone-faced in front of him. "What, did your husband die and you just keep going, soldier?" It was a joke meant to humiliate. But it landed like a grenade. Because in that instant, everyone saw it, the flicker of pain she didn't show, the shadow that crossed her face for half a heartbeat before she locked it away behind the steel of discipline. The air grew heavy. The smirk faded from the admiral's mouth when he realized she wasn't laughing. No one was. Iron Widow didn't move. Didn't blink. Her silence spoke louder than outrage ever could. He didn't know it yet, but the name that had made him laugh would soon make him fall silent. Because that call sign, those two words, were born not of vanity or rumor, but of a story that had reshaped the very definition of courage. Her real name was Commander Elara Kane. To those who knew her, she was more myth than memory, more scar than skin. She'd once been a pilot in one of the most brutal rescue operations the Navy had ever classified. Her squadron was ambushed during a humanitarian extraction deep in enemy territory, a mission that went wrong before it even began. They'd been outnumbered, outgunned, and out of options. When her commanding officer was shot down, Elara took command mid-air. The sky that day had burned. She could still smell the metallic tang of fuel in her throat, the taste of smoke and blood mingling as she screamed coordinates into her headset. The static had filled her ears like drowning. And yet, through that chaos, she guided 3 crippled aircraft home, flying hers until the wings gave out and the world became fire. They said she shouldn't have survived. But she did. Barely. Her husband didn't. He'd been in one of the downed transports. She'd watched from above as his signal went dark. She'd flown through enemy fire trying to reach him. She never did. When they pulled her from the wreckage days later, her burns were so severe that the medics couldn't tell if she was alive. But she was. She always was. That's how she earned it, Iron Widow. It wasn't a name given out of admiration. It was whispered in the beginning, out of awe and fear. Because she kept flying after that. Alone. Every mission. Every time the odds were impossible. She had become the one they sent when no one else would go. But the cost of survival is silence. Now, years later, standing before the SEAL admiral in that sterile conference room, she carried that same silence like armor. The admiral, oblivious to the weight of his own cruelty, reclined and folded his arms. "You know, Commander," he said, "if I didn't know better, I'd think that name's a myth. A story for rookies." She didn't reply. Her stillness unsettled him. There's a certain kind of power in restraint. The kind that forces even arrogance to confront itself. Around the table, the younger officers avoided eye contact. They'd heard the rumors, the classified whispers, the things no one could prove but everyone felt. Then, the door opened. A man entered quietly, his uniform immaculate, his face unreadable. A vice admiral, one of the few who outranked the man mocking her. The room instinctively rose to attention. He didn't speak to anyone else. His eyes went straight to Elara. And when he saluted, it was not out of protocol. It was out of reverence. "Ma'am," he said simply. The admiral frowned. "You salute her?" "I do," the vice admiral replied. "And so should you." The words landed like thunder. The mocking admiral's expression faltered, confusion flickering across his face. The vice admiral stepped forward and placed a folder on the table, opening it with deliberate precision. Inside were photographs, scorched landscapes, wrecked aircraft, the fragments of missions that had never made the news. The vice admiral didn't look up. "Operation Silent Reach," he said quietly. "The one that saved 72 hostages in enemy territory. The one every commander refused to authorize because it was suicide." He turned a page. She went anyway. Alone. The room was utterly still now. The admiral's jaw tightened, the blood draining from his face. Her husband was on one of those transports, the vice admiral continued. She didn't wait for orders. She flew through ground-to-air fire, with both engines failing, and covered the retreat. She lost her wingmen, lost her own co-pilot, lost everything, except the people she went to save. Every one of those hostages made it home. A pause. A heartbeat. She carried her husband's dog tags out in her flight glove, burned into her skin. Now the admiral couldn't meet her eyes. Elara remained silent. Her gaze was distant, fixed on something far beyond the room, something no one else could see. The vice admiral closed the folder. The survivors called her Iron Widow. The name wasn't a joke. It was an oath. The admiral's hands trembled slightly as he stood. His chest rose and fell like he was short of breath. The realization hit him with a force that felt like collapse, not of body but of pride. Every mocking word he'd spoken now echoed back like a curse. The officers around the table stood as well, one by one. Not because they were told to, but because they knew. In silence, they saluted her. The admiral tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. I didn't know, he murmured. I didn't. Elara finally looked at him. Her eyes, calm and unreadable, softened for just a moment. Respect, she said quietly, isn't something you give after you learn a story. It's something you give because you never know the story. The admiral's composure broke. His shoulders sagged under the weight of her words. In that moment, he wasn't a leader. He was a man ashamed of his blindness. As the meeting ended, the room remained hushed. The young officers lingered, watching her with a kind of reverent silence that words could never fill. She moved with quiet grace, gathering her notes, never once looking for validation. Outside the conference hall, the late afternoon sun painted the naval base in molten gold. The air smelled faintly of salt and jet fuel, a scent that had followed her most of her life. She paused by the memorial wall that stood just beyond the flagpole, running her fingertips across the engraved names. Her husband's name was among them. A shadow approached. The vice admiral again. He didn't speak at first. The silence between them said enough. Some of them forget, he said finally. They see medals and think they know what courage looks like. She nodded faintly. Courage isn't loud. He smiled. No, it's not. They stood together for a long moment. The wind lifted the flags above them, the faint rustle carrying the ghosts of voices long gone. She touched the small worn chain that still hung beneath her collar. Her late husband's dog tags were cool against her skin. Later that evening, word of what had happened in the briefing spread quietly through the base. The admiral who had mocked her called for a private apology, but Elara refused to meet him again. She didn't need an apology. She'd already forgiven him in the silence that followed his humiliation. Forgiveness wasn't weakness. It was release. By morning, the younger officers had changed the way they greeted her. There was a new weight in their salutes, a new awareness in their eyes. And when they passed her in the corridors, they didn't whisper the name as a legend anymore. They spoke it with respect. In the weeks that followed, the admiral who had mocked her resigned quietly. The story of his collapse circulated like a cautionary tale, a reminder that arrogance and ignorance are often the same uniform worn differently. Elara returned to her duties, mentoring new pilots who had only heard pieces of her story. She rarely spoke of the past. But sometimes, when a young recruit asked about the name, she would simply say, "It's a promise. To never forget what was lost, or why we keep going." That was all. Years later, during a memorial ceremony at Arlington, the sky was clear and cold. Rows of veterans and soldiers stood in solemn ranks, the air sharp with reverence. When Elara's name was called to lay the wreath, the crowd parted in silence. Among them stood men and women who had once served under her command, those who had survived because of her choices. Their eyes followed her as she walked to the marble headstones, the medals on her chest catching the faint winter light. No one spoke. But when she placed the wreath and saluted, hundreds of hands rose in unison. The hush that followed felt sacred, as though even the wind understood. Somewhere, a child asked her father who that woman was. The father, a veteran himself, simply said, "That's Iron Widow. The one who never stopped flying." It's strange, the way true respect grows, not from authority or fear, but from witnessing quiet strength. The world doesn't often remember the ones who stay silent. But silence, when it holds the weight of truth, can outlast every voice that ever mocked it. Elara Kane never needed to raise hers. She had already spoken through action, through endurance, through every life that still breathed because she refused to stop. And that's the lesson that outlived. Her rank, her name, even her pain, that power doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it simply stands. So when the admiral had laughed that day, when he turned her call sign into a punchline, he had no idea he was standing in the presence of the very courage his rank was meant to represent. He learned too late that respect is not owed to the uniform, it is owed to the story behind it. There's always another silent hero who deserves to be seen.